We are back once again with some brand new content. It is totally different than our post-draft video, not at the same time. Um, as you can see, I'm wearing a hat backwards this time, and Jake has a different white shirt on.
Yeah,
So,
my hair's just as fucked up as before, so it was a different time for
this
sure.
is a PG podcast. We don't cuss.
Take two.
No, we're fine. We're gonna get demonetized on the YouTube because we make a lot of money off this podcast for our 7 views. Um, anyway,
We
so
have more
this is
views than that. We got 30 something views on our last podcast.
that's wild. Anyway, um, we are here for some new content. We have never done this before. We are going to break down teams completely. Normally, we kind of do just like power rankings before the year, talk a little bit about teams. We're going to do some in-depth, team building, really go in depth on these teams. And the way we're doing is doing 3 teams per video. So there'll be 4 different videos, 4-part series here. And we're doing reverse standings order from last year, which brings us right away. I guess we could just jump in unless you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think it's a fun little addition we got going on here. Hopefully, everyone likes it. Otherwise, we just wasted our time, but that's cool.
Hopefully we get another 30 views. We're like famous. That's more than double our league members. That's crazy to me. I'm gonna have to go look at that. Um, so thanks all you random folks that are watching us and want to keep track of our league. But we're gonna start off with the team that finished last year. Danny, he went 0-14. He scored under 1,000 points for the league total. I truly had no memory that Danny didn't win a game last year. But coming in with a different team, obviously, hopefully you watched the pre-draft video before this, so you know what his draft picks look like. And I think we're going to jump in, start with the most important position. And Danny's loaded at quarterback.
Yeah, I think we could start with quarterback. I think that's probably Danny's strength at this point. Obviously, made that big deal for Mahomes in the middle of last year, and then he still got the number 1 pick, so he picked Caleb Williams, and now he has. I don't know where they're ranked, but I assume they're both top 5 dynasty quarterbacks or close to that. And yeah, so good, solid baseline. Interesting to see. I know we'll talk about it later. He still has a lot of picks, so maybe he's starting to move in and get a running back or something like that. Not really sure what his plans are for this year, but I know he has 2 good quarterbacks, so it's time to start thinking about winning.
Yeah, and I mean, loaded QB room. I mean, he's got the number 1 QB in the league. I think that's is it arguable? I think it's probably not arguable at this point. Mahomes, and probably if we started the dynasty today, he's the number 1 pick. So he's got the best player in the league. That's a good start. And then he's got Caleb Williams. Watch our pre and post draft videos to see how we feel about him. But awesome. I mean, if not, probably the best QB room in the world, in our league anyway. And for our 30 viewers in the world, because our league is the world to everyone. I think, the Bryce Young trade is still a little funky to me. He probably, could use Bryce Young as the third QB, and that's my one fear with him is only having the 2. So his QB room just loses that little credibility. Bryce Young, I think, is very different when you consider him Danny's 1 last year to what would have been his 3 this year. And just because we're going a little in depth, I pulled it up real fast. Do you know what Danny traded away to get Mahomes?
I know it involved A Chain.
Correct.
I assume I want to say Pollard, A Chain, and something.
Pollard, A Chain, Kenny Pickett, and a first, which was Trevor's first, which would have been which would have been 5, I guess.
Trevor's
No.
first last year was 3. I guess you got that pick somehow.
Yeah, I guess so, somehow. And then he got Mahomes and Warren. So very interesting. I think, the fact that Marv ends up going for 3 in that trade makes it a little more even. Otherwise, you got to think that Danny fleeced Mitch. If this is a different, if that Trevor pick doesn't come out to 3. But that's super interesting that I got that pick. That's I don't know how I did that. Good for me. But uh, but again, what's your fear that he only has the 2? Because mine's pretty high. I feel like you need 3.
I don't know. I think he'll survive. As long as he has 1. He has a lot of receiver depth. For bye weeks, he could kind of fill those guys in for that. Like I said, he has a lot of picks. I think, as it has been, Danny's weakness is running back. You don't really want running backs till you're ready to compete anyway. So maybe now's the time to start going and buying some. Maybe not, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, he could also get a cheap quarterback. It's not like some Gardner Minshew level quarterback. I know he just got traded, but something like that doesn't cost you all that much. It's all he really needs. These 2 guys are the ones who are going to be starting anyway.
All right. Well, you mentioned running back, so going through his running backs here, Jaylen Warren, Blake Corum, Roshan Johnson, and Eric Gray are the running backs currently on his roster. And that's a little scary. He doesn't have a single starting running back, theoretically, on his team. I think people like Jaylen Warren more than Najee Harris, and I can see that argument. But technically, I think Najee is RB1. So his running back room is really pretty scary, and I love Roshan Johnson, but his running back room is scary, and clearly the Bears just paid a boatload of money to bring a running back in to go over Roshan Johnson, who already had Herbert to compete with. So, maybe you have a little bit more value on these guys than I did. You liked Cora more than I did, but that running back room scares me.
Well, I like Corum more than you did, but he's still not starting, so there's still the same problem. Warren has decent amount of talent. Obviously, he's not getting all the work. They're pretty somewhat 50-50. I think he'll be usable as a running back. We've seen teams with worse running backs win the championship, so he probably needs a 1. But other than that, he seems like it's okay.
Would you rather have Pollard, Marv, and A Chain to Mahomes and Warren right now?
Well, I feel like Pollard's value's dropped a ton.
Sure.
So it's a lot more closer to A Chain and Marv versus Mahomes. I think you can make that argument. I think it's. I really don't think it's a steal. Obviously, it really depends if A Chain can hold up. So if A Chain
Yeah.
can hold up, then it's pretty even. Otherwise, it's kind of didn't work out, I think.
Very fair. And I was just curious what your thoughts are. But yeah, his running back room is a little scary. Moving on to wide receiver, bear with us because he's got about 40. We get to start with Devonta Smith, George Pickens, Jackson Smith, Najigba, Jordan Addison, Zay Flowers, and Christian Watson. Let's cut it off there for now. We'll talk about the rest in a moment. But those are his top six wide receivers I just listed.
Yeah.
Crap load of potential in that room. I think he's got guys that really are high draft picks with high draft capital. Starting with Devonta Smith, I'm lower on him than the world is, but you're pretty high on him if I remember correctly. So, what are your thoughts there? He's got AJ Brown still to compete with for touches, but can he be wide receiver 1?
Uh, if AJ Brown's there, he's not going to be wide receiver one on that team, if that's what you're talking about.
No, in fantasy. Can you go to the playoffs with Devontae Smith kind of as your wide receiver one?
So you would need really good running backs. Like I think his max is going to be like wide receiver 9 or so, probably. As long as AJ Brown stays healthy. If AJ Brown gets hurt, then I think all bets are off. I think he could be a top 5 receiver probably, with the amount of volume he'd get there. But I think assuming everyone stays healthy, he like his maximum is probably like a back end wide receiver one. So if you're Danny and you have his running back situation, I don't think you're have a real chance to win if he's your wide receiver one.
Okay, and I think that's pretty fair. Moving on, he's got George Pickens. I, I'm super low on Pickens compared to everyone else, and I think compared to you as well. I struggle to say he's even Danny's wide receiver two. I probably have him more as Danny's like wide receiver five, which is I think probably crazy to most folks. But he's in Pittsburgh. He is supposed to get more touches now with the lack of wide receiver help around him. New quarterback there. What are your thoughts on Pickens there?
Uh, I think Pickens, he's a hard player. I think in different formats, he's probably a little more valuable. I think it's hard to start him week to week. It feels like kind of someone that spikes up and down, which isn't really my preference, but I know a lot of people play like that. I think I think he's a talented player. I mean, he had a really good second year. Um, Assuming he gets better, he should be in line to be a wide receiver two this year, if which is possible. Obviously, the quarterback situation's interesting. Russ is not great anymore. Different people have different opinions on Fields. I mean, Fields was able to maintain a wide receiver one last year, but only that wide receiver one, and also DJ Moore is a lot better player, so you can't really count on that. So the quarterback situation is rough, and then you also have Arthur Smith, who's a lunatic. So
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think with Danny's receiver coverage that we just talked about, he can kind of play the matchups. Would be my guess. If Zay Flowers has a great matchup this week compared to a Jordan Addison, maybe that's what he does. So any of those next guys, the Jigba, Flowers, Addison, Watson, you expecting anything big time there? They be propelled? Can they be almost every week starters?
I feel like I've been talking about this forever. It feels like Danny has like 5 of the same receiver. It's just like waiting for someone to break out. I don't know who it'll be. I guess my favorite of them personally would be JSN, I guess. Maybe Zay Flowers. I've been lower on him than a lot of people, but at the same time, like Andrews has been hurt here and there. Lamar is the best quarterback that any of those guys have. Well, Watson probably has the best quarterback, but I like some other receivers there. Um,
No, I
yeah,
think I think that's very fair. And I think those guys we've kind of touched on. Moving kind of to the rest of Danny's receiver rooms, Dontavian Wicks, Jermaine Burton, Troy Franklin, Kadarius Toney. Is he on a team now? Where is he?
I could let you know in a second.
Because I know he got cut. I think. Um, then I'll keep going just because while you look at that, Jalen Hyatt, A.T. Perry, and John Mitchie. Um, we talked about Burton and Franklin in the post draft. Go watch that. Uh, Jalen Hyatt is in a weird situation with the Giants. I don't know what to make of him. Looks like you are ready with your answer on Tony.
He's not. He does not. He's not on a team right now.
Okay. I mean, you assume he gets rostered at some point. I really like John Mechie, but it looks like they've now kind of replaced him in Houston. He was sick his first year and then, never really got a super chance. It looks like Tank Dell took his place. It looks like, they brought in Diggs. Um, so of any of those guys I just mentioned, do you expect any of them to propel him just this year? Anybody there you can see gets some starts and looks good.
So I think everyone after Franklin you could probably cut. Personally, I think those are kind of waiver wire guys. They have some potential. All of them got some draft capital, so you could have them on your roster, but none of them you need to. I could see Wicks. I think he's an interesting player. I know like the metrics really like him. The metrics like him more than Watson, even. I know Watson has had more success, so hard to put him over him. But I think there's a lot of potential with Wicks at least. But at the same time, there's like 4 or 5 receivers in Green Bay that all have like somewhat decent potential. So it's hard to imagine like any one of them just separating from the bunch. But I guess it's possible. So I guess if you're talking about separating to a fantasy level, I guess I'd say Wicks from that group you were talking about.
Okay, that's very fair. I think I would probably go Troy Franklin. Interestingly enough, I think he walked into about as good a situation production wise as a rookie wide receiver can, coming with his college quarterback. Kind of taking Judy's spot with Sean Payton, I think works out. I don't think he really has to compete that hard for some of these touches in Denver. But I think you're right on Wicks. But I'm always confused by the Green Bay receiving room. I think I've always kind of been, even in like the Jordy Nelson days, it just always was an enigma to me. I just never understood how they did anything in Green Bay. Um, even their offensive, this is nothing to do with fantasy, but they like draft like just fourth round interior linemen, and then they become good somehow all the time. So just like a side note on Green Bay. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think Danny's receiver room for the last 4 years, 3 years, whatever it's been, we've said a lot of potential. Someone needs to become that guy, and I think we're still kind of waiting for that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so still a waiting game. Obviously, I think we're both pretty high on a decent amount of his receivers, so still a chance that one of them breaks out, but till then, he's just kind of in a waiting game.
Mhm.
Um, Moving on, I guess tight end. I mean, he only has one. It's Johnny Smith, so it's not a great one. Probably needs some help there if he wants to compete. Don't know what his plans are in regards to that position. I know we've talked a little bit about a couple tight ends at some point, but not recently. So
Yeah, I mean, I tight end's a tough spot for him. Tight end is probably the least important position in many ways, so that's fine. But yeah, a little rough there at tight end with Johnny Smith, but I'll leave it at that. Um, Moving on to his future potential. Um, in next year's draft, he's got two firsts between himself, and he also has Mr. Jones's. You'll see Mr. Jones's prediction later in a different video, guys. So go watch that to see how we feel about that pick. Um, but Danny's, you'll see our prediction about his in a few minutes, just to see how we feel about that pick. But a little hint, we're probably going to pick. I think it's going to be a pretty decent pick. He doesn't have a second rounder, but he does have a third. We're going to cap this as just talking about 1 through 3, just as a heads up, because we don't need to talk about fourth and fifth rounders. Um, and then next year, 2026, the year after, he's got two firsts again. And then that one, he's got his own and Taint's. And then he's got his own second, and he does have Mitch's third for some reason. Um, so some decent draft capital for Danny's sake. Two firsts in the next 2 rounds can possibly do something along those lines, which is pretty decent.
yeah, yeah, a lot of flexibility for him. He could probably get a stud RB or a stud tight end if he wants to with some of those picks, or just keep them and wait to draft. Feels like at some point he's got to get a running back, but not my team. So who am I to say?
Yeah. So little over under. Last year he got 0 wins. Placing the over under at like 3 this year. Does
Three
Danny
this
win 3 games?
Hmm. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go under. I'm gonna go with. I think he'll get like two. I think three's like probably where he ends up. So I guess it
Hmm.
predicting a push,
Sure.
um, but I'll go under. I think it's more likely he goes to two than he goes to four.
Well, I feel pretty good about my line I created then because that's awesome. Um, if we're predicting a push right away, I'm gonna pick the over. I do think that Mahomes and Caleb can win at least 2 to 3 games on their own. So I'm gonna pick the over. I think Danny probably get, but again, if the over under is 3 and I created the lines, that's probably where I think they're gonna be. So we've mentioned it a little bit already, but Danny's big strength. What is it?
Strength one, I think, is quarterback, and the other, which is somewhat obvious, I think strength two is going to be his draft capital that he has with not having to get a quarterback. So they kind of intertwine together. So he has draft capital, but he doesn't need to go out and buy a quarterback, which will be expensive. So I think that's his strength, in my opinion.
I I think that's very fair. The last strength we've already touched on is just his receiver potential. Big weaknesses, running back room. I'm not even going to include the tight end room. It is a weakness, but if I'm going to pick it down to one weakness, it is the running back room. I don't. I'm assuming you concur on that based on what we've already mentioned.
Yeah.
All right, and then you're Danny. You're sitting in Danny's shoes. You've got the great quarterbacks, the bad running backs, the receivers with potential, and some draft capital. What do? Are you trading capital and wide receivers to go grab a running back? Are you sitting put to try and go draft some? What are you giving up to get a tight end? Do you trade some of those receivers to get a tight end? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, trading's always hard at the start of the season. I might try to like use a third or a second to go out and like get like a someone's backup tight end that they don't really need that has like that I could play for a couple weeks. I think that's kind of where I go with it. I'll see how the running backs turn out. Maybe I do a first for like running back that's getting a little older and a tight end or something like that. Just so I could fill out a starting lineup. I think Warren could be your RB2. So you really need another starting running back, and then you kind of I think after that you just kind of wait it out and you see how everything plays out. You sit there with your draft capital and you come in and swoop in when people are starting to get more desperate.
So again, this is a hint to go watch our post draft coverage because we talked about this in depth with Lemon, and we're going to talk about him in a second here. But if you're Danny, do you go and maybe offer one of those wide receivers? You're plentiful of them for like Dawson Knox. Lemon has 3 tight ends now. Do you go try and make that pick?
Yeah, I mean, if that's an option, you could always do that. I mean, I don't know, like it depends what the value is, right? So, like if you get, I don't know, like I know Dalton Schultz just got traded. Like that would
Yeah.
probably be a good person for Danny if he could have traded like one of
Hmm.
those, like a Wicks or a Burton for Dalton Schultz just to have someone on the roster, something like that. But like
I'm with that.
he just has too many receivers, and it's just like you might as well move some for something that you could use. I don't think you're in a position where you need to just fully tank anymore at this point.
All right. I think we've covered Danny pretty good. If you guys think we missed anything on these, please let us know. But I thought we did a decent job covering everything. And for the strangers who watch our videos, because we get so many views apparently, you make sure what we need to include so that you guys feel included in this league. This is a worldly league. But now we're moving on to Lambchops. Finished 3-11 last year. Former champion of this league. Finished with just over 1,000 points, which, for context, gave him about 15 more points than Danny scored last year. So he was about 15 points away from Caleb Williams. So maybe one little tank trade gets him Caleb Williams instead of Jaden Daniels, who he did pick. But let's start off with his QB room. Jaden Daniels, Baker Mayfield, Bo Nix, Zach Wilson. So he's got the Broncos QB room at 3 and 4. Baker, who was a solid starter last year, and then Jaden Daniels, the rookie with some potential. QB room is a strength, weakness. How you feeling about Lamon's QB room?
Uh, I wouldn't say it's a weak. I mean, if you're trying to compete, I'd say it's a weakness, right? Like if he's probably doesn't have a QB1, he probably has two QB2s, probably somewhere towards the top of QB2. So a lot of teams that are competitive have better than that. So um, in terms of that, I'd say it's a weakness. I don't think it's like he's not scraping together like Daniel Jones and some other quarterback you really don't want to start. So it's not a extreme weakness, but it is a weakness if you're trying to compete.
I think that's fair. I really like Jaden Daniels, but he's a rookie. He's going to have rookie issues. I'm higher on Bo Nix than you, but he's a rookie. He's going to have rookie issues. Granted, he's an older rookie, so hopefully he limits those a little bit. Baker, I think, is pretty solid. Like you said, he's a QB2. If you're Lamon, best case, Jaden Daniels shows year one he's going to be a QB1. And Baker continues to be a QB2, and Bo Nix shows he's a QB2. That's best case. Worst case, Bo Nix and Jaden Daniels look bad, and Baker has some severe regression, which I think both of those are possible, which is a little scary. But I like his QB room. I think, for a team in his position, two young QBs and possible trade for, someone who needs to go to the playoffs and needs a QB in a few weeks, maybe goes out and gets Baker Mayfield. And that gives Lamon some sort of depth piece or pick capital or another position of need. And, Zach Wilson, wild he's still in the NFL and, on the team and whatnot. But anyway, I think we can move on to Lamon's running back situation. I think I'm curious to see what you think his running back situation is compared to Danny's. Personally, I think it's slightly better than Danny's. But Lamon comes into this with Trey Benson, Zach Charbonnet, Will Shipley, Buck Irving, Miles Sanders, Damian Pierce, and Tyler Algier. So, like I said, I think it's a little bit better than Danny's, but what does your comparison look like there?
I think it's a little worse. Just I don't know. I wasn't as high on Benson, so you were higher on Benson. I was higher on Corum, so that's probably a difference there. Warren's probably the only person you can start on a weekly basis out of both of these teams, so I kind of just lean towards Danny because of that. He really needs to fill one RB spot. Although, I mean, it depends the way things work out. If certain players get hurt, then Lambchop's RB room actually becomes really good. Like, I like Algier's talent. Pierce has some talent. Irving may get some work. I think Charbonnet is super talented. So he has a lot of guys that could end up being good. It's just none of them are going to start the year scoring points.
And I think that's probably why I viewed his a little better. He just has more, I think, good options. I think Benson, Charbonnet, Irving, Pierce, Algier, and even Miles Sanders still has some value there, in my opinion. Especially Brooks starts the year injured in Carolina. I know Chuba's still there, but what that looks like between Sanders and Chuba. Pierce now behind Mixon is tough, but I think Pierce still has something there. I think last year was odd. I don't really understand how he went from great year one to bad year two. And then I think Algier, like I said, I think previously really got the short end of the stick when Bijan got drafted because that dude is talented and can play. And who knows, Bijan goes down or Mixon goes down or, it's the same thing for Danny's. But I like Lamon's options more, with Trey Benson over Corum being a big part of that. On the flip side, I don't like Lamon's receivers as much as I like Danny's. And going through them, you get Jaden Reed, Xavier Worthy, Lad McConkey, Jonathan Mingo, and then I'll include Josh Downs in Lamon's first grouping, and we'll kind of separate it again compared to that. So those kind of guys right there. What are your thoughts on Lamon specifically?
Yeah, it feels like these guys are almost in that second tier of Danny's receiver core kind of group. They're, I mean, they still have a lot of potential. I like the fact that there are a decent amount of receivers with good quarterbacks. Reed has with between Green Bay, Kansas City, and the Chargers, all have good quarterbacks. So that's always nice. Downs, it feels like that wide receiver room's getting pretty crowded for how much they're going to be able to throw. At least that's my opinion. Some people think Anthony Richardson can be a really good quarterback passing wise. I'm not sure about that. So I don't know. I think they still have, like, I guess I'd put them slightly above the other group and Danny's. Not in between Danny's two groups. I'd have pretty much all of these receivers. I'm not a big Mingo guy, but
I think that's really fair. I really like Jaden Reed. I really like the situation he's in. I think Reed is better than both of the receivers that Danny has from Green Bay. Weirdly enough, that we're talking about all of the Green Bay receiving room right now. I think it is very possible, but that both McConkey and Downs just dominate in the slot. And maybe a full PPR league would have helped Lamon out a little bit with those two. And Xavier Worthy could be a touchdown machine. Interesting what happens with Mahomes. So I like the potential here. But yeah, I think it's a little worse than Danny's, as I think we both said. Um, if Lamon has a breakout receiver, is it Jaden Reed or is it one of the other guys?
uh if it's gonna be a breakout receiver, I guess I would say it's Worthy. Um if he gets that Tyreek Hill role and they figure out how to use him right, then I think he could end up just breaking out and being a monster. But yeah, I just feel like the Green Bay receiver room is just too crowded for anyone to be like a breakout receiver, I guess.
I can live with that answer. With that, we'll finish out Lamon's receiver room. Jalen Polk, Devontae Walker, Roman Wilson, all draft picks. Juju Smith-Schuster is on his roster right now. KJ Osborne, Tutu Atwell, and Elijah Moore. Go watch our post draft once again for our thoughts on Polk and Walker and Wilson. So I won't touch on them all that much. Again, this is his bottom half of his receiver room. I still am a huge Eli Moore guy. He peed on the post in college, so then his draft stock dropped. When his draft goes to the Jets are terrible. They have Zach Wilson. His stock drops. He gets traded. He's in a weird situation. It feels like he's almost never gotten a real shot to be elite, and I still think he's got a lot of potential, and I really like Eli Moore. So I'm excited to see if he can kind of put some things together and be a good receiver in the NFL.
Yeah, I don't know. Hard to just keep holding on to that. I did like
Yeah,
him coming out of college, but it's been a decent amount of years, and you'd be surprised if he ends up breaking out now. Especially they just brought in more receivers and whatnot, and so still don't know if Deshaun Watson's ever gonna go back to how he used to play. But yeah, I like. I guess we won't need to talk about it too much, but I did like the back end receivers he picked in the draft.
hmm
So I think he did a good job with that.
yeah, and just another one to touch on. KJ Osborne feels like he's one of the top receivers for Pittsburgh, New England this year. Just because their receiver room is a little shaky. So just someone to maybe look out for as a spot starter, or someone who maybe isn't behind Justin Jefferson and Thielen or Diggs and stuff now, and maybe can show something out. But moving on to tight ends, we touched a lot about this in our draft video, but he's got Brock Bowers, the number 1 rookie tight end, Ben Sano, the number 2 rookie tight end, at least according to the NFL. Dawson Knox, who has been his boy forever. He rode Dawson Knox to a championship, weirdly enough to say, and then finishes off with Michael Mayer, who is now behind Brock Bowers. So at this point, you got to assume Brock Bowers is going to start almost every game moving forward. And that feels pretty awesome for Lime.
Yep. Yeah. Has someone he could start at tight end. Probably doesn't have to make, outside of injury, probably doesn't have to make another tight end pick for a long time. So set up pretty well. And yeah, we'll see how good Brock Bowers is, I guess.
And like I said, Lyman and Danny, Dawson Knox sitting there could be a really interesting trade candidate for you guys. Anyone who needs a tight end. He's now tight end 3 for Lyman, when in reality, I think he's a pretty good tight end. Like, I like Dawson Knox, so I don't know. Maybe that's just me. And I'll just touch Michael Mayer, really kind of upsetting that they went Brock Bowers for him, because I think he's a guy who could be a really good tight end in this league, but can't imagine they're supporting 2 tight ends in fantasy. Which brings us to, unless you have anything on Mayer or Knox.
No, you're all good.
Well, then I'll just touch on Lamon's draft capital. Next year, he's got 2 firsts, including his own and Trevor's. So we're going to talk about Trevor here in a moment. So you'll actually get to see both our predictions on where those picks lined up. He has 3 seconds with Taint, Mitch, and his own, and then 2 thirds being his and mine. And then the year after, he's got his own first and second, and then 2 thirds with his own, and then Mr. Jones. So some draft capital. He's got 2 firsts next year. He's got 3 seconds. So he can really. We just talked about he had 13 picks in this draft. So less next year, but still, a way to really tank and get better, which is kind of the hope for him. Which brings us to his over-under. I put his over-under at 2. And I debated a long time on that. So what's your thought?
I'll go under.
I am too. I almost had his over-under at 1, and that felt just a little extreme. First of all, we know he's going to beat me at least once, because I've never beaten him in this league, I don't think. Like, ever. He's always beating me. And I'm sure we're in the same division, so we at least play once. I think we played twice under this league rule. So that's 1 win. We know it's happening. But I like a lot of his pieces. He just, it's revamp time for him, and I think he's in a decent spot to do that.
Yep, I think so.
His big strength.
I don't know what his big strength is. It feels like it's very spread out everywhere. I guess I would say quarterback is his strength.
So that's really interesting that you put it that way, because my thought on his strength was his depth. He's just got pieces that could be good in every position. And I think his tight end room is a strength. But he has receivers that theoretically could be good, running backs that theoretically be good, and quarterbacks that theoretically could be good. That's a lot of things that need to go right for that to happen. But I do think his depth is his strength, because there's a lot of potential to be okay. But what's his big weakness?
I don't know if I want to start any of his wide receivers. I think that would be his big weakness for me.
Okay, so I think that's fair. I think his big weakness is probably, I don't know if you want to start any of his running backs or receivers. He just doesn't have a top end person right now. Now that ETN is gone, he traded ETN to me. the consensus in this league is that I lost that trade pretty badly, particularly from you Stony Brook people. And you guys are pretty rude about it, but that's okay, because we love you all. For our out of league viewers, because this YouTube is we're really popular on the YouTube. They're really rude to me on my trades. So all this work I put in for this league, just so you know. But they certainly have. He certainly has some weaknesses. Now, you're Lamon. Again, you're sitting in Lamon's chair. What do you do with this team? What's your next step? You got draft picks. You've got players. What's your next step?
I'm probably just playing for next year. If one of the RBs becomes the head RB, I might trade that for another first rounder or something like that, or look for opportunities where I can get even more draft capital, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah, I'm thinking, closer to the trade deadline as the season goes on, Baker Mayfield needs to become a trade, a tradable piece. And I think one of those tight ends needs to be tradable. And yeah, I think, running backs and wide receivers are a little tough. If one of them becomes an RB1 to trade away, just because his running backs are super young. Like, he doesn't have an old guy who becomes a RB1. But I think it's not the worst idea to make that trade. So we both think Lamon under 2. It's a struggle for him right now, but I do like some of his pieces, and I think we both thought he had a pretty good draft as well. But that brings us to our third from worst team. Is that how you say that? Second from worst?
Third
Whatever.
worst?
Yeah, third worst. Second from worst, I guess. That brings us to Mr. McGee. He went 4-10 last year. He scored about 200 plus points, 219 points more than Lamon did. So, solid enough last year, but he went 4-10, so not great. Starting with his QB room, Aaron Rodgers, Daniel Jones, Drake May, Joe Milton, Stetson Bennett, Jordan Travis. What are your thoughts?
Pretty nasty. Those are some
Nasty as in good?
No,
Okay.
not good. You don't want the New York quarterback room, that's for sure. I don't want any piece of those. Drake May has some potential, but not really starting at the start of the year at least. So we'll see what he turns out to be. Nice to have 2 starting quarterbacks, so he has that going for him. But not the highest potential, I don't think. I'm not a big thinker. I don't really think Aaron Rodgers has much left, so not super high on him. Never was super high on Daniel Jones, but that is what it is.
Yeah, it's funny because I think those 2 are my 2 least favorite quarterbacks in the NFL for various reasons currently. But I think Rodgers is done. Maybe he proves us wrong. I really hope he doesn't. As I said, not a big Rodgers guy. But he looks not great moving around, and he had a real bad injury. So we'll see with him. Daniel Jones, these are 2 guys that this may be their last years as starters. Are they possible trade pieces later on? 100%. Drake May, I think we agree, potential there. Joe Milton, I think we also agree that we're hoping that they put a QB/tight end moniker on him in fantasy, because I think that's hopefully what he's doing. Hopefully, I just think he needs to be on the field. He's got a lot of athletic freak talent. And now something that's really quite funny is his last 2 are Stetson Bennett and Jordan Travis. Go watch our post-draft again to see our feelings on the Jordan Travis pick. It may have been voted as the worst pick in the draft by at least one of us, if not both. Go see. And then go watch our pre-draft of last year to see my feelings on Stetson Bennett being picked. I really should apologize to that man. I was very rude. I don't know him. He's probably very nice. I don't know anything about him. But I was not a fan of that pick, apparently, at the time. I think I've been proven fairly right there, but that's a whole different ball game. So, yeah, I think he's got a lot of work in that QB room. Drake May should be starting week 4 to week 10, somewhere in that mix. But other than that, some scariness there in that room. So going on to the running backs, starting off with Mr. Saquon
Of
Barkley.
course, I mean, I think week
Oh.
to week, you were zoomed out for cut out for a second.
You also cut out for a second, so I don't know what everyone else just heard.
So anyway, great.
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
on a weekly basis, the quarterbacks could perform well enough for him to be competitive in games, but at the same time, not optimal, I guess, is how I would leave that off. Uh, Moving on to running backs, he has made a lot of progress in the running back category, I think. So his running backs now are Saquon, Jonathan Brooks, Ramondre Stevenson, Khalil Herbert, Gus Edwards, Jaleel McLaughlin, Dylan Laub, Kenneth Gainwell, and Israel Abulubulu guy.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so I mean, he got Saquon this year in a trade with you, but included Jaden Waddle, um, Barkley in a new spot with the Eagles. Interesting. They paid him. Anyone who watched the Giants Hard Knocks, the Giants, Joe Sheen is amazed at how much money Saquon was getting, but he was also amazed at how much everyone was getting. So um, take that with a grain of salt. Jonathan Brooks out the first couple of weeks coming off an ACL, but the number 1 draft pick of this year's class. And then Ramondre Stevenson going to start in New England. Herbert sitting behind Swift, you'd assume, based on what Swift was paid. And then Gus Edwards, who is at least a touchdown vulture, if not the starter, with what's his name, Harbaugh out there. So, I think this room has some decent potential. I don't know about you.
No, I actually like this room a decent amount. I think he's pretty solid at running back at this point. So I think he's kind of filled. That was kind of his biggest weakness last year. I think he's pretty much filled that. Once Brooks is back, he should have 3 starting running backs that are pretty decent. And Gus Edwards has some backup guys that could become good. He has Gainwell in case Barkley goes down, so he's kind of filled all that together basically. I actually like the running back room a decent amount.
Nice. Well, I think that brings us to the wide receiver room. Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, certainly the top 2. Then he goes to Xavier Legit, Adam Thielen, and Khalil Shaker. So what kind of break that receiver room down for us?
Very top heavy. I don't really think the bottom 3 will be super usable this year. I guess Shakir has some potential with everyone leaving Buffalo. He's shown something, so I kind of like him. So somewhat of an upside play there. I wasn't high on Leggett. You were, so maybe you think that Leggett could do some stuff this year, but Thielen seems somewhat over the hill at this point.
Yeah, this receiver room, had we done this 2-3 weeks ago when Jalen Waddle was still there, super awesome. He had 3 receivers you can start every single week. Obviously, he got rid of Waddle. He got Barkley, so his running back room is much better, and got Drake May out of that as well. So I don't think we can complain that his receiver room is lessened. He just diversified talent, I would say. Wilson, awesome. I think, top 10 receiver. Puka, I'm still a little down on. I hate to admit, but if he can continue 90%, 80%, 75% of what he did last year, he's a really solid wide receiver 2 with some wide receiver 1 upside. Xavier, again, how many times can you actually start a rookie wide receiver? Here's hoping he does well because he seems like an awesome person, and I do like him. But yeah, it's very top heavy. he's got two receivers that he should lock in every week and almost not think about. And then, has enough running back situation to flex, which I think is really what you're asking for out of those two positions.
Yeah, definitely. All right, moving on. Tight end. He has a really good tight end room. Kittle and Goddard. Kittle's obviously the starter there. Goddard's there in case anything happens to Kittle, which has happened before. So he has a starter and a backup there. He's done a really good job, I think, of filling out his whole roster. He has starters at every position. I don't think we could really say that last year. So I think he did a really good job in the offseason, especially given he had some lack of resources that he was working with.
For sure. I mean, you theoretically you plug Kittle in every game, and got solid backup tight end. So I think you're right. He does have a start at every position, but it seems still a little funky in my head. It's probably a little better than I realized. But moving on to his draft capital, there's not much here. He doesn't have a first or a second next year, but he does have 2/3, his own in taints. And then the year after, he does have his first, doesn't have a second, then has his third. So his draft capital is really limited. It's kind of always been limited. His draft capital has been limited since he traded for Saquon Barkley for 3 firsts in our first year. Because I know when he traded Barkley away, he didn't get that value back. That was one of those where he didn't have faith in us that this league was going to continue to year 4 or 5, whatever we're on now. So he traded away the first to try and win a championship, which eventually worked. He did win a championship. So can't fault him there. But I have listed the over-under at 5. That's one more win than last year. Rodgers is back. Roster's kind of filled out. What are your thoughts?
I'm gonna go with the over on that. I think that he's pretty solid everywhere. By week 4 or 5, he'll have 3 starting quarterbacks. May has some potential with the rushing and also some passing, given they invested some in receivers this year. I like the running back room a decent amount. I think Barkley and Ramondre is a pretty solid duo. Brooks coming in as a wild card could end up being pretty good. And then he has some guys on the bench I like as well. And then he has 2 really good starting receivers. So I think his team's pretty solid. I'd expect him to get over 5. I think that's pretty fair. I saw you change that from 4 to 5. I was pretty happy when it was at 4, but a little less happy at 5 going over. But I'm still going to go over.
Yeah, I probably am going to go under. I think 4 is probably where he ends up again. I think there's QB questions. I think there's QB injury questions. His lack of depth at wide receiver scares me. And frankly, I'm not as high in the running back room as you are. I like Barkley, but after that, I have more questions than I think you do. So, I'm going to give him 4. Is probably where I think he ends up. But I think there's some big questions here. Moving forward, my biggest strength for him is that he's filled out his roster very, very nicely without the resources. How he's done it has been really kind of crazy. How he managed to do all this. But where are your strengths?
I mean, having the 2, I mean, you probably disagree, but having the 2 lockdown wide receivers is really nice to have. No real thoughts about who's going in your wide receiver room week to week, which I know sometimes a problem with me. Some of my guys are similar in value, similar in rankings, so it's hard to decide between. I think he gets to just put them in, forget about it. I really like having that for him. Similar at tight end, just having Kittle's is nice. You just don't think about it.
I think that's very fair. I don't disagree that his 2 wide receivers are, you plug them in and let them play. Just because I'm down on Puka doesn't mean I don't think he's a starter every week. I just don't see him as where he was in some people's mind. Weaknesses, I would say his lack of depth. Um, injury, one or two little injuries in his team really kind of implodes. So while he's been able to really fill out every position, it's been limited to pretty top heavy, other than quarterback, which I think is bottom heavy and still problematic. So that's where I'm going with his weaknesses. I don't see a great quarterback room. I struggle with his running backs after Saquon, and really his wide receivers, at least for this year after Puka, scare me as well.
Yeah, weaknesses for me. I think he could use an upgrade at one of those quarterbacks, either Rodgers or Jones. If he could figure out how to do that, I think that would help him a lot. Other than that, I think he could use like a older receiver to kind of put on the bench that he knows has decent value, just in case one of them misses a week or two or something like that.
Sure, I think that's fair. And now for one of the more fun, I think this is probably the most fun versions of this one we've had is you're Trevor. What do? You have no draft capital. You filled out your team. Um, do you try and go get draft capital? Do you stay as is? Do you try and even go for more wins? Like where are you looking here?
Yeah, so I think what I'm doing, my initial thing I'm trying to do is seeing if I get any value for some of these RBs that aren't going to start for him, or even a Ramondre, see where his value is at in the league. See what kind of draft capital I could get for those kind of guys. Obviously, RB's hard to find, so having them, I might see what someone's willing to offer for that. After that, I might try to see if I can tier up from Daniel Jones or Rodgers. Probably a hard thing to do, but just get another really solid quarterback that'll be around for a little bit that you could pair with Drake May moving forward. I think either of those is fine. Might try to sneak like a older, like I said, older receiver kind of backup guy in with one of those trades. Basically, is kind of what I'm thinking.
Okay, I mean I don't necessarily hate that. I think I would disagree. Um, Frankly, I think that the first thing he needs to do is maybe hit up Lambchop and try and go get his first round pick. Lambchop is sitting there with his first round pick, which is problematic because Lambchop's in tank mode, and that is theoretically going to be a pretty good pick. But I think if I'm Trevor, I maybe start in the tank. I maybe start in the tank. He's got a lot of pieces that make the tank a lot easier. Barkley has value, Wilson has value, Puka has value. As much as we're down on those quarterbacks, they could have value. Rodgers is having a decent season 5-6 weeks into the year. He probably has first round value. And that's probably something he needs to jump on. And same for Danny Jones. So if he can accumulate, similar to what he did this year, 1 or 2 first round picks, I think he does that. Garrett Wilson and Puka Nacua alone are probably worth 3 first rounders. The combination of those two. You throw in Saquon, and all of a sudden, he's probably got those 3 players. Probably, in some trade values, it's 5 picks, or some young players or things of that nature. If I'm Trevor, just because of the question marks at quarterback after this year, I probably start trying to look to get some draft capital and some young player capital. Now, Puka and Wilson are, but Barkley's at the older age of those running backs. Those quarterbacks are, who knows what they look like after this year. So that's probably my thought, just given that he has 1 first in the next 2 years, and not a second round pick to speak of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if he wants to go that route, it's probably easier. Obviously, this is the start of the year. People want to see if they can compete this year. So he has some players that are available. I think I'm fluent both ways if I'm him to see kind of what offers I'm getting, what I can offer to other people, go both ways.
Yeah. And so with that, I think that finishes our first of our 4-part series with our deep dive into last year's struggling teams. We disagreed on the over-under on Danny and Trevor. However, we both agreed Lamb was going under. So sorry, Lambchop. But we had the over on. You had the over on Trevor. I had the under, and we switched that for Danny. So good luck to our 3 guys we talked about this week. And I hope you guys like kind of this deep dive into what those rosters look like.
All right. Peace.